Rory, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you, a pleasure.
And talking to us. We wanted to ask you a couple of questions, if that's right.
Of course.
One of them was that the understanding of the future of marketing is in social media, and you're a big proponent of that. How are businesses going to best use that?
Part of the future of marketing is social media. I'm both alarmed at two extremes here. People who neglect social media completely when it may be hugely important, and other people who are what I call sort of extreme advocates who believe that all decisions are taken entirely socially. Oh. Right. It depends which category you're in part. Now, I'll give you a fairly simple example. Our decision-making processes seem to use different sources of information depending on which category we're buying in, or indeed what other decisions we're taking. So there are some things where we're very heavily influenced by what other people do. And that's the general thing that needs to be understood. It isn't necessarily a question of using social media. It's simply the fact that we're a social species, and quite a lot of the time we find it easier and indeed more efficient, and in many cases better, to make decisions by effectively copying what other people do. And there are all manner of kind of Darwinian and other reasons why we do this. There are some categories in particular where I think social media will be hugely important. So, for example, if you take categories which are generally low confidence categories, where the brand itself isn't a particularly good proxy for product quality, then social media recommendations and so forth will be absolutely critical. So one example would be, I think TripAdvisor is a serious innovation in terms of economics, in that previously, if you take an example like a hotel in a sort of reasonably good tourist location, it was fairly easy to run a pretty crap hotel or a really crap restaurant in a tourist location. Why? You weren't dependent on repeat business, because all your customers were only going to eat there once. You weren't really subject to reputational damage because, let's face it, your customers were going to be, your potential customers or past customers were going to be flying back to Luton in 2 days' time, and they weren't going to wander around Luton saying, if you're in Marrakesh, don't go to the 4th restaurant along on so-and-so street because it's crap. So in that case, in terms of being able to confidently make a decision, particularly when we're in a strange place, those social reputational mechanisms are immensely important. And actually, on the basis of that, I'd almost invest in the hotel industry, because I think that the popularity of using hotels will increase in the next 10 to 20 years as people's confidence increases, simply because you can now go online and get a reasonable indication of which hotels are going to be pretty good and which of them are going to be rubbish. There are still risks. People can game the system, people can cheat, people can post positive reviews of their own place. But nonetheless, I would say that for the hotel industry and for certain restaurants, the TripAdvisor is very, very important indeed. I'd also say, however, that it's worth remembering that brands and brand preference in some categories incorporate social information. So the wider reputation of a brand isn't a bad indicator of what other people think of it to begin with, that brands are a kind of social construct. So I don't see the time when people, before deciding between EasyJet and British Airways, will actually go and read 200 reviews of past passengers of those airlines. So the different media that have influence and have importance. Another area where social media and social reputation will be of critical importance is in, for example, the film industry. I mean, it's always been known that the opinion of the opening weekend audience has a massive success on whether the film makes it big or whether it sinks without trace. What you're seeing now because of social media is the effect is being exacerbated. So a good reaction to a film on the opening weekend, whether it be the latest Bond film or whether it be some clunker, will kill very fast or indeed amplify very fast.
But how does the consumer trust what they're reading? As you said, they could be a blogger or a...
There's some evidence that shows, I mean, film reviews have always existed.
Yeah.
There's some interesting evidence from Amazon, for example, that people actually pay more attention to peer group reviews and peer group opinion than they do to the opinion of, self-appointed experts.
Yeah.
That isn't always irrational, because a lot of people like me will probably share my tastes in film rather more than a bunch of film critics. I've never been able to sit through Last Year at Marienbad. I know it's supposed to be, the greatest art film ever made, but I must admit, after half an hour, I'm losing it. Okay, and actually, peer group opinion in those things is probably a pretty good guide to what you'll enjoy yourself. There's also the aspect, of course, to which films are to some extent a form of social enjoyment anyway. Even if we don't go to the cinema with other people, a film is more enjoyable if you watch a film knowing that quite a lot of your friends will have seen it, because it provides you then with discussion value and so forth. So no, I would never say that social media is the future of advertising. I think advertising works in many, many complex ways, and depending on the category you're in, the business sector you're in, and what kind of brand you are, it's fair to say, then actually the influence of social media will go from absolutely immense to almost non-existent. Some categories of consumer good, I think it's something like deodorants, don't seem to be affected remotely by social influence. People just buy them as if they're individuals.
Well, I imagine people don't really discuss their deodorant needs.
No, I mean, I'm probably an extreme category. Now, equally, you have other forms of influence, which would be expert influence. So in choice of a hemorrhoid cream, very few people are going to post on Twitter, anybody got recommendations for a hemorrhoid cream, but you would listen to your doctor, or you might go to a medical blog and consult that. But I'm very, very wary, and I think this is one of the points I'll probably make this evening. I'm very, very wary about generalizations made around media, because I think the fundamentals of marketing and of advertising need to be understood in terms of individual behavior, individual human behavior. And to make a generalization about a medium is very dangerous, because of course different people use different media for completely different things. And so there's always this huge danger that people say, well, of course, television is all about X, social media is all about Y, you use press for Z. And pigeonholing and stereotyping media and what they're for strikes me as dangerously limiting all of them. Yes, they have individual relative strengths and weaknesses, but that will depend on what you're trying to achieve to start with. And so, yes, television is very, very good for excitement, and quite often people want more interactivity with television. I can see occasions where second screen viewing with TV, so the freedom to say watch a sporting event while also consuming it in parallel on a tablet or some other device. So the stats come through the tablet and the action comes through the television. That kind of symbiosis makes a lot of sense to me, and I can see that there's probably growing demand for it. But there will also be growing demand for the complete opposite, which is television I can veg out in front of. And, the obsession of those kind of interactivity nutbags who are all about, we always want to interact. No, sometimes we do. There are certain areas where, there are certain television programs. I would argue BBC Question Time is only watchable if you also follow it on Twitter in parallel and catch up on the kind of wisecracks and gags and snarky commentary. At the other extreme, there's television where I simply want to sit there basically and veg out and say to my large screen, entertain me, I'm not going to do anything for the next 45 minutes apart from stare in kind of slack-jawed amazement at the screen. So generalizations about the role of media, including social media, are something to be avoided. The reason I think that gets more important is actually now we have a more complicated media ecosystem in which to operate. We do need actually to stop generalizing about media and start actually understanding far more how people use different media. Because ultimately a media is something someone uses for some end that will vary massively from one context to another, one behavior to another. And if there's one lesson of the behavioral sciences, by the way, about human behavior, it's that context really matters. It's not enough to say we have this kind of person and that kind of person. This kind of person then and this kind of person tomorrow might be more different than two different people simultaneously. So understanding that, I think, is one of the most important lessons we've learned over the last 10 years.
So do you think, for example, people are now going on about how the 50-plus demographic is the biggest one that we have?
Yep. It's relatively prosperous, I imagine, as well. Yes.
Taking what you've just said in terms of generalisation, are you seeing market changes driven by this top-heavy age bracket that we have?
It's an interesting question. First of all, there are groups of people. It's an interesting question, which I think is worth asking. First of all, is the marketing industry a bit too young? And the second question is the marketing, is everybody in marketing of a particular personality type? Now, Geoffrey Miller, who's a friend of mine, a Darwinian psychologist, makes the point that one of the qualities that almost one of the sort of big six personality values that differentiate people is openness. Openness to new experience, openness to experimentation. Two things about that, very important. It's one of the personality types, characteristics which declines with age, the only one, I think, that significantly changes with age. And as you know, I mean, we all know, we get less experimental when we get a bit older. Secondly, people in marketing are disproportionately on the very, very high end of openness. They're the kind of people who will go on, their idea of a holiday is, I don't know, touring Venezuela or something, okay? They're obsessed with, for example, using brands and products to differentiate themselves. A very large part of the population, and this increases with age, just wants to fit in and do sensible things. And actually, particularly for logical reasons, the older you get, the less you need to do new things because you already, to some extent, know what you like. And there is a danger of a disconnect between the marketing mentality, which is all about saying, hey, you must try this, it's new, and the mentality of people, particularly people of lower levels of openness, or people in, in their 50s and 60s, which is, I already know what I basically want. My tastes are now slightly more conservative and less experimental than they were. Please, can you supply me with them? And so there is that concern I'd always have that marketers, partly because of their youth and partly because of their personality type, you don't get very many people in marketing who are kind of reclusive or introverted.
No.
And actually one of the things I find frustrating about working in marketing is that people are so relentlessly sociable. I quite like being sociable, but for every hour of being sociable, I quite like an hour of silence to read a book. And sometimes you go to a marketing event and you realize that these people will be happy to stand around chatting over drinks for 14 straight hours if you left them to it. And that's just enough already. And so there is an interesting question as the demographic ages, and also there's an interesting question about the value of brands, which is marketers always assume that the best brands are those which are cool and of the moment and highly fashionable. Actually, the really valuable brands are those which are a trusted brand in among a conservative audience, because those are the people you can genuinely rely on to be your customers. And so there is, I think the whole question of an aging demographic and, of course, the unrepresentative nature of marketing folk does raise some questions for what marketers need to be learning over the next 10 years.
And finally, when you talk very inspirationally in terms of looking at issues in a different way. What would you encourage business leaders to do to change their focus from, let's say, the current economic climate and doing nothing? What would you like them to consider?
One of the things would be that the power and influence of a very naive neoclassical economic model over business decision making, nothing wrong with it, it's a model, it's a way of looking at the world, okay? And actually, well, of course, all models are wrong, but some of them are useful, as the man said very intelligently. And there was nothing wrong with this model in the early days, because like all models, it started off as an aid to thinking. But it started to become a substitute for thinking, where people just assume that these rules of neoclassical economics, which are not based on any empirical observation, they're just theoretical, are effectively the only way you need to look at the world. So if you look at a board of directors nowadays, 95% of a board meeting will be looking at numerical metrics of some kind. But there are an awful lot of truths about the world that you can't capture in simple Newtonian physics or numerical metrics. So the really important thing is, before you make a decision, try looking at it in several different ways. And I'll give you just a very casual example of this. There is a slight recession, there is probably a decline in ad spend, so the automatic assumption is we must cut back on, for example, T&E or client entertainment. Now, looked at from an economist's point of view, that is the completely rational only thing to do. In other words, in a declining market, you cut back on those peripheral things. On the other hand, if you're a game theorist, you look at it differently. You'd say, all of our competitors are going to be cutting back on entertainment. actually we should double our spend on entertainment, and we should cut it back by half when times improve. Because there's no point in entertaining clients when all your competitors are busy entertaining them. They won't even notice, and they'll probably find your drinks party a pain in the arse because they've been to 4 of them already. Okay? So actually, looked at from a game theorist perspective, what you do is the opposite of what an accountant would do. Now, I'm not saying one of them is right or wrong. What I am saying is that the monocular way of looking at the world, which economics has created, is simply unhealthy. And I'll extend that, by the way, to personal decisions we make in our everyday lives. 2 of the things you can do when making a decision, I think, are: 1, let us look at this in 3 or 4 different dimensions, rather than getting obsessed with one comparative frame. Okay? There's an element to which we can get trapped. I mean, for example, when people move house, it's a very important decision. It's worth spending quite a lot of time. Most people make that decision by basically settling in on a London postcode and looking nowhere else. Well, you can't look at every postcode simultaneously in London. You go mad. But equally, if all you've done is look within half a mile of your existing house, you're not really doing justice to the decision. The second thing I'd always say is, whenever you're looking at a comparative set of 3 houses to move to, in order to validate the decision, throw in a wild card, which is an option which is significantly different to the other 3. Because what often happens is we get trapped by what Freud calls the narcissism of small differences. Yeah. And we start getting obsessed with 3 things which are similar to each other and going, well, that one's got a greenhouse, but the other one's got a slightly better balcony. And we're obsessing about that as if those are the only decisions in the world. And we completely forget the answer to ask the question, actually, well, in the case of a second home, should I buy a second home at all? I've argued, for example, that if you buy a small flat in London to use as a pied-à-terre, you think, well, this is perfectly reasonable because it's property and it's an investment. But the council tax loan is going to cost you £3,000 a year. For £3,000 a year, you can join the RAC club and sit in a place which has a Turkish bath, a swimming pool, a staff of 30. You can stay overnight in a 5-star hotel room for, you know, 60, 70, 80 pounds. Is actually the answer buying a flat at all? Similarly, if you're buying a holiday home, well, hold on, for £3,000 a year in council tax, I can have a hell of a lot of nights in 5-star hotels. And actually, that business of, 1, try framing the problem in 4 or 5 different ways, and 2, whenever you have an option, throw in a wild card. Because you can't be entirely sure that you're not just comparing options by ease of comparison, rather than comparing all available options. And estate agents apparently know this and play this trick on us, which is, when they want to sell you a particular house, they will show you, first of all, a rubbish house, just to sort of waste your time. And, you know, then they will show you a house that's pretty similar to the house they want to sell you, but isn't quite as good, but they will claim that the asking price is slightly more. Then they show you the house they want to sell you, and immediately you go, well, this one's got a greenhouse and it's £4,000 less. And because you've made the comparison very easy, you automatically think that the fluency of the comparison means you've made a good decision. When actually the first house they quoted you may have been overpriced by 100,000, and you're there merrily going, well, this one's £5,000 cheaper, so it's obviously a bargain. And so, you know, it's absolutely clear in the decision sciences that there are little tricks we can play. The other one I always advise, and you know, I'm not always comfortable talking about biases, because quite a lot of what we do in terms of decision making is actually an example of hidden intelligence. It's not irrationality at all. So the example I always give is, having a preference for advertised brands may not be insane at all. If you think about it, someone spending money advertising their product is a bit like a racehorse owner betting on their own horse. It's a pretty good indicator that someone who knows a lot about that product thinks it's pretty good. So not to use that information and not to let that information affect your decision is actually irrational in itself, because it's highly significant information. But there are cases where I think we do suffer from biases, where we can be happier by understanding how to avoid them. And one of them is sunk cost bias. The sunk cost bias, which is, I've already committed to this course of action, and therefore I must follow it through, regardless of whether the follow through is net beneficial or not. And I'll end with a very quick story of how behavioural economics benefited me in this, which is, I'd booked with my wife 2 non-refundable business class tickets. They weren't particularly expensive, actually. They're about £100 each, business class return to, I think, Paris on BMI, I think it was, a few years back. And they were non-refundable. We're due to fly out to Paris on the Friday. Thursday evening comes, might have been Friday morning, and basically both of us are going down with appalling flu. And we're there packing, because we paid for these goddamn tickets, okay? So we've got to go through with this. Now, we hadn't booked a hotel, and we hadn't committed to anything else. And I would have gone through with it, basically spent another £400 that weekend in order to feel shit in art galleries, to feel shit in restaurants, to feel shit in cafes, okay? But having just read, I think it was a book by possibly Tim Harford, possibly Richard Thaler, I said, hold on a second. If we hadn't booked these tickets, there isn't a chance in hell we'd still be going to Paris, okay? The fact that we've booked the tickets is irrelevant. That cost is written off. The only decision now is, do we really want to spend another £400 feeling shit in Paris? No. So what we did is actually I took the tickets and symbolically ripped them up and chucked them in the bin. So okay, we'll write that off. And we actually spent what is, when you're mildly ill, quite a pleasant weekend at home, kind of wrapped in duvets, overdosing in Lemsip and watching rubbish on television. And we had a far, far better weekend than we would have done going to Paris, and we saved ourselves £400. Ergo, it is a good decision. But something about the human psyche means that once we've made a kind of upfront sunk cost commitment to something, we feel this completely irrational need to persevere. Now, what I'm not suggesting is you lose all perseverance and all commitment at all, because if we did, nobody would ever turn up to anything. You know, we need commitments to actually, you know, stay true to our word and so on. But understanding that there is an option which is actually ripping up the tickets might be cheaper and more enjoyable than going through with plan A. Just knowing that once or twice or 3 times in your life, just knowing that will be really, really useful to you. It'll save you making a disastrous mistake.
Well, thank you very much.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you very much indeed.